last few years, the media has routinely dismissed the idea that economic anxiety explained any part of the rise of Donald Trump and other right-wing populists. But it turns out economic anxiety might account for more than people think. Given the way things are currently going for Joe Biden and the Democrats in general, it's not impossible that in 2024 we could find ourselves revisiting the question, why did people vote for Donald Trump? You might recall that after the 2016 election, when people tried to take a serious look at the factors that led to Trump's upset win, the mainstream media collectively lost its mind over the suggestion that any person who voted for Trump might have been motivated by anything other than raging white supremacy. For instance, Senator Bernie Sanders caught flack for saying things like this.
The reason he is doing so well is there is a lot of angst in this country. There's a lot of pain in this country, a lot of hurt in this country. You got millions of people who are working longer hours for low wages. You got 46 million people living in poverty. People are seeing their jobs go to China. They're seeing their jobs go to Mexico. And what he is saying, I understand your problems. I will tell you that I think there needs to be a profound change in the way the Democratic Party does business. It is not good enough to have a liberal elite. I come from the white working class, and I am deeply humiliated that the Democratic Party cannot talk to the people from where I came from.
Some people think that the people who voted for Trump are racists and sexists and homophobes and just deplorable folks. I don't agree. I don't agree, because I've been there. Now, let me tell you something else which some of you may not agree with. And that is, it wasn't that Donald Trump won the election, it was that the Democratic Party lost the election.
In response, journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates excoriated Sanders' statements as, quote, a sweeping dismissal of the concerns of those who don't share kinship with white men. And the idea that economic anxiety was a bogus explanation meant only to excuse the seething racism of Trump voters quickly became the overwhelming consensus among the liberal commentariat.
This is not, in fact, about economic anxiety. There are plenty of problems with the economy, but that's not what's behind
What
Trump.
is it about then? What is behind
race.
it?
I mean, ultimately, it's about race. I mean, you cannot understand anything that's happening in this election in U.S. politics without seeing it as a certain, unfortunately, a fairly large fraction of Americans who don't like the fact that we're becoming a multiracial, multicultural country.
Because they think that eats into their economic opportunity?
No, it eats into their identity. It's really not about economics. You know, all the economic anxiety among people I talk to, economic anxiety has become a kind of a joke slogan.
Think piece after think piece insisted, top Democrats are wrong. Trump supporters were more motivated by racism than economic issues. And it was cultural anxiety that drove white working class voters to Trump. And white fear elected Trump. One especially popular style of commentary in this vein was, science proves it was racism and not economic anxiety that led people to vote for Trump. Journalist Mehdi Hasan, now a host over at MSNBC, was especially committed to this beat.
So who are the people who put Donald Trump in the White House? Is this a revolt of the dispossessed, of the left behind, of globalization's losers? Is it a backlash against free trade? Some of the top voices on the US left seem to think so. But what if the economy isn't the main driver? What if it's racism and racial resentment that helped put Trump in the Oval Office? What if it's the white lash?
Build that wall! Build that wall! USA! USA! Get out!
That's economic anxiety?
In a 2018 column for The Intercept, Hasan made it clear just how fed up he was by talk of economic anxiety. After running through a handful of studies on the racial resentments expressed by Trump voters, he wrote, "Do I really need to continue? Do I need to cite more studies, more surveys? How can this still be a matter for debate?" Well, the reason this is still a matter of debate is because we, in fact, have plenty of other rigorous studies and surveys that indicate that yes, economic anxiety, so to speak, did have something to do with the Democrats losing in 2016. As you can imagine, the media didn't cover these studies in nearly as much detail, so let's run through a few. First of all, it's important to note that literally none of the researchers discussing the role that economic anxiety played in the rise of Trump have dismissed the idea that racial and cultural resentments are connected to this anxiety. The argument, rather, is that when economic conditions deteriorate and thrust people into long-term hardship, the opportunities for demagogues like Trump to swoop in and stoke racial resentment are that much greater. For instance, a few years ago, sociologist Andrew Cherlin undertook an in-depth study of Dundalk, Maryland, a former Democratic-leaning steel town that lost thousands of blue-collar union jobs over the course of several decades and voted overwhelmingly for Trump in 2016. In 1960, 70% of Dundalk residents over the age of 25 hadn't even completed high school. Yet the median household income in the town at this time was still well over the national average, thanks to robust employment at nearby manufacturing plants like General Motors, Western Electric, and most crucially, the Bethlehem Steel Company. 81% of the housing units in Dundalk in 1960 were owner-occupied, which is to say that thanks to union wages, most workers in this town were able to buy homes and achieve a middle-class standard of living. However, in the 1970s, a series of bad trade policies and an economic recession devastated the steel industry, and the manufacturing jobs that supported most of the families in Dundalk began to vanish. When the Bethlehem steel plant near Dundalk finally closed in 2012, only 8% of the town's labor force was employed in manufacturing. The town's population had shrunk and opioid addiction was rampant. According to one social worker, the jobs that most residents now held were at places like the grocery store or the part-time position at the health clinic. As she put it, they are not livable jobs with livable pay. The hours are inconsistent. What Andrew Cherlin found through extensive interviews with residents of this once thriving steel town was that Trump had been able to tap into their long-standing distress over decades of falling wages and the permanent disappearance of a type of work that gave them a sense of pride and dignity. For instance, one former steelworker told Cherlin that he had gone to Washington with other steelworkers in the early 2000s to lobby for tariffs on imported steel, but neither Democrats nor Republicans had been willing to listen. In fact, it wasn't until 2016 that a high-profile candidate would talk about steel tariffs on a national platform, and that person, of course, was Trump. Cherlin writes that the steelworker he spoke to took off his glasses and fought back tears as he related how great it felt many years later to listen to the ceremony at which Trump signed the order establishing tariffs on imported steel. He acknowledged that the tariffs may not be effective or even good policy in the long run, but Trump had done something. Despite having worked for Democratic candidates in the past, he's ready to campaign for Trump's re-election. Now, Cherlin also notes that plenty of white Dundalk residents did express their economic woes in racial terms, complaining, for instance, about the increase in Section 8 housing, code, of course, for low-income black families, or increased immigration at the same time they lamented the lack of good jobs in the area. That tracks with a different study where two social psychologists looked at census data and unemployment rates to figure out whether increased racial diversity in a given neighborhood caused white people to vote for Trump. What they found was that white residents felt threatened by increased racial diversity only in areas where there were high rates of unemployment. In other words, it wasn't simply more diversity in and of itself that led to feelings of resentment among whites during the 2016 election. Rather, economic conditions also played an important role in determining whether whites perceived more threat and tapped into feelings of racial grievance. As Cherlin put it, Trump's masterstroke was to recognize the desperation of the white working class over the deteriorating industrial economy and to encourage their tendency to racialize that desperation. Neither economics nor identity politics can be said to be the more important factor. Together, they were tinder for the bonfire that resulted, and Trump was the match. The idea that deindustrialization and long-term manufacturing job losses laid the ground for Trump and other Republicans to pick up voters who felt abandoned by Democrats has been further confirmed by a 2021 study that looked at voting patterns in former factory towns across 10 states in the industrial heartland, also known as the Blue Wall, that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. In the study, Democratic strategist Richard Martin found that, much like the residents of Dundalk, Maryland, voters in former manufacturing counties that had been devastated by deindustrialization and free trade deals like NAFTA steadily migrated from the Democratic Party to the Republicans. Within the states Martin looked at, Barack Obama handily won mid-sized manufacturing counties in 2008 and won them again by more than 100,000 votes in 2012. In 2016, Hillary Clinton lost the exact same counties by over 800,000 votes. There's again evidence that Trump's populist rhetoric on trade resonated with voters in these areas. As Martin points out, in Donald Trump's first debate with Hillary Clinton, he mentioned unfair trade deals 9 times, NAFTA 8 times, and kept reminding people that it was Hillary's husband who signed it. In 2016, even CNN couldn't help but notice that Trump's speeches on trade sounded an awful lot like the socialist candidates.
Since 2001, we have lost almost 60,000 factories in America.
Jobs, jobs, jobs.
And the major reason for that is a disastrous trade policy.
We have trade agreements that truly are so one-sided that they are now harming and really hurting our workers.
So the point here is not that racism, opposition to immigration, or cultural anxieties played no part in Trump's electoral victory. The point is that if we're serious about preventing a re-election of Trump or the rise of another right-wing demagogue who simply knows how to talk a good game on trade, it's important to understand exactly how so-called economic anxiety and the Democrats' abandonment of pro-worker economic policies did influence people's decisions to vote for Trump, both directly and indirectly. We also have to understand why racial resentment turns into such an effective lever for politicians like Trump if we're to have any hope of quashing it. As Andrew Cherlin put it, racism is a corrosive part of American culture and politics. Nevertheless, those who try to distinguish between the explanatory power of stagnant wages and a declining industrial base on the one hand, and anxieties about the ascent of minority groups on the other, miss the point. These are not 2 different factors, but 2 sides of the same coin. Finally, some might ask, why should we care about what's going on with the people in these former manufacturing towns? Why not just let them become Republicans and try to pick up votes from more enlightened parts of the country? The problem, simply put, is that under our current electoral system, these are the places that still make or break national elections. According to Richard Martin, these largely working-class, former manufacturing counties contain 40% of all voters. Even though Democrats have come to dominate cities and suburbs, their losses in these manufacturing counties overwhelmed the party's gains in urban areas by over 2 million votes in 2016. But of course, it's more beneficial for MSNBC pundits and other commentators to advance a narrative that Trump voters were and are nothing more than irredeemable racists. After all, that's the kind of sanctimonious talk show discussion that's designed to soothe the egos of liberals who hate the working class and are looking for any excuse to write them off. But as 2016 should make clear, at the end of the day, willfully ignoring one major cause of the Democrats' ongoing loss of working class support is not only a moral shortcoming, it's also a disastrous political strategy. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.